In 1992, construction workers building a highway in San Diego dug 9 feet into the ground and found something that should not exist. Buried in the dirt were the broken bones of a prehistoric mastodon smashed open next to stone hammers, sitting in soil that was 130,000 years old. That number is not a typo. It means someone, or something, was cracking open animal bones in California over 100,000 years before humans were supposed to have set foot anywhere in the Americas. If this discovery is real, it does not just add a new date to a textbook. It rewrites the entire human story on this continent. Before we get into how deep this rabbit hole goes, hit subscribe, because this channel exists to dig up the discoveries that mainstream history would rather you never question. Let's go back to where this began. It was November of 1992, and the California Department of Transportation was expanding a stretch of highway known as State Route 54, right where the city of San Diego meets National City. Under California law, any major excavation like this requires a paleontologist on standby. Fossils turn up in California more often than people realize, so the state keeps trained specialists on site to watch the machines work. That day, the specialist on duty was a field paleontologist named Richard Cerutti, working for the San Diego Natural History Museum. Cerutti was standing near a massive excavator watching it chew through sandy soil when he noticed something unusual sticking out of the ground. At first, he thought it was a tusk from a mammoth. Construction stopped immediately. The heavy machinery that had been ripping through the earth all morning was pulled back, and the site switched over to slow, careful hand excavation, the kind used by scientists who know they might be sitting on something important. Over the following months, Cerutti and a team led by museum paleontologist Thomas Desmarais kept digging, joined by other paleontologists including Karen Crafts, Chris White, Don Leylander, Larry Eigenbrod, and James Mead. Funding for the emergency excavation came in through a grant from the National Geographic Society, because everyone involved understood that whatever this was, it needed to be documented properly before the highway project buried it forever. What emerged from the ground was not a mammoth. It was a mastodon, a close but distinct relative, an elephant-like creature that once roamed North America until it went extinct roughly 11,000 years ago. They uncovered tusks, molars, ribs, vertebrae, and limb bones. Alongside the mastodon, they also found the remains of other Ice Age animals in the same layers, including dire wolves, ancient horses, camels, and ground sloths. At first glance, this looked like a fairly ordinary paleontological find. Ice Age fossils turn up in Southern California more than most people assume, but almost immediately, the team noticed something that did not fit the ordinary pattern. Some of the mastodon's bones were broken in strange, deliberate-looking ways. Long limb bones were snapped in a spiral pattern, the kind of fracture you get when fresh, still flexible bone is struck with force, not the kind you get from centuries of slow decay or erosion. Sitting right next to these broken bones were several large stones. 2 of them were nearly a foot across, and the biggest weighed more than 30 pounds. These stones showed clear wear patterns and impact marks, the kind you would expect from something used as a hammer and an anvil. There was another detail that struck the team as strange. One of the mastodon's tusks was not lying flat, the way you would expect a heavy object to settle after thousands of years underground. It was standing on end, embedded vertically in the sediment. That is not how gravity, erosion, or slow burial typically leave something that heavy. It looked, in the plainest sense, like it had been placed. Even the 2 large leg bone joints called femur balls were arranged in a way that stood out to the team, one resting face up and the other resting face down, close enough together that it looked deliberate rather than accidental. Small flakes of bone were also found clustered tightly around the largest stones, almost like a debris left behind, right where the breaking happened, rather than scattered randomly the way a natural process would leave them. So the working theory started to form. Somebody had used those heavy stones to smash open the mastodon's limb bones, most likely to get at the fatty marrow hidden inside, a valuable and calorie-dense food source for anyone trying to survive in the Ice Age. If that theory held up, it meant humans, or at least something in the human family tree, had been at this exact spot, doing exactly what hungry hunter-gatherers have done at kill sites for tens of thousands of years across the world. Here's the problem. Nobody on that team was ready to believe how old this site actually was, and figuring that out would take more than 2 decades. The first attempts to date the bones ran into a wall almost immediately. Scientists tried standard radiocarbon dating, the method used to date almost anything from the last 50,000 years. It failed, because the bones simply did not preserve enough of the organic collagen that radiocarbon dating depends on. They tried a different method called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures how long grains of sediment have been buried away from sunlight. That method suggested the site was at least 60 to 70,000 years old, already staggering, already far older than anything remotely close to the accepted arrival of humans in North America. But the true number was still hiding. Between 2012 and 2015, a scientist from the United States Geological Survey named James Paces applied a far more advanced technique called uranium-thorium dating. This method tracks the slow, predictable decay of uranium into thorium inside bone and sediment, and it can reliably measure ages stretching back more than 500,000 years, well beyond the reach of radiocarbon. Paces ran the analysis on nearly 100 individual samples taken from the mastodon bones. The result came back consistent, and it came back stunning. The bones were buried in sediment that was approximately 130,000 years old, give or take about 9,400 years. To understand how enormous that number is, you need to know what the accepted timeline looked like before this. For decades, the mainstream archaeological consensus placed the earliest confirmed human sites in North America at around 14 to 15,000 years old, tied to the last ice age, when falling sea levels exposed a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, known as Beringia. That was the story. Humans crossed that bridge, or paddled along its coastline, somewhere around 15 to 20,000 years ago, and spread across 2 continents from there. The Cerutti site blew a hole straight through that timeline. If the dating was right, something was smashing open mastodon bones in California 115,000 years before that accepted date. Not a few thousand years earlier. Not even 10,000 years earlier. Over 100,000 years earlier. Before this dating result, most of the researchers involved assumed they were looking at something old, but nothing this extreme. The uranium-thorium numbers did not just push the timeline back a little, they shattered it completely, and the team knew this claim needed more than one dating method and more than a hunch, so they went further, trying to rule out every ordinary explanation. Could the bones have simply been crushed under the weight of sediment over thousands of years? Could scavenging animals have caused those spiral fractures by chewing or trampling the carcass? To test this, researcher Stephen Holland actually went out and broke the limb bones of a recently deceased elephant, the mastodon's closest living relative, using stone hammers in the same way they believed ancient hunters had. The fracture patterns matched. Spiral breaks, percussion marks, the same signatures seen on the Cerutti bones. According to Holland, this ruled out the usual suspects. It was not carnivore chewing. It was not the crushing weight of the earth. It was not animals trampling the remains. Now here is where the story gets genuinely mind-bending, and it's the part almost nobody outside of academic archaeology has ever heard. If this site really is 130,000 years old, the people responsible cannot be us. Not modern humans, not Homo sapiens, the species you and I belong to. According to the fossil record, anatomically, modern humans had not even left Africa yet at that point in history. Our species' major migration out of Africa is generally placed at somewhere around 60,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years after this mastodon died. So who, or what was standing in California, smashing open bones 130,000 years ago? The scientists who published this discovery in the journal Nature in 2017 could not name a species. In their own paper, they were forced to describe the responsible party only as an unidentified species of the genus Homo, not modern humans specifically, just something human, or something in our extended family tree. At that point in prehistory, a small handful of other human relatives existed on Earth. There were Neanderthals, mostly spread across Europe and parts of Western Asia. There were Denisovans, a mysterious and poorly understood cousin species known mainly from fragments of bone and DNA found in a Siberian cave, whose genetic traces still show up in some populations in Asia and Australia today. And there were the last surviving populations of Homo erectus, an older, more primitive branch of the human family that had been spreading across Africa and Asia for almost 2 million years. One of the researchers involved in the discovery, Richard Fulligar, went even further, suggesting that recent genetic research shows we are not dealing with a single isolated species migrating in a straight line. Instead, he described it as a kind of blended intermixing population of different human groups, meaning whoever reached California that long ago might not fit neatly into any single category we currently have a name for. Some researchers have even pointed to Homo florescensis, a small-statured relative discovered on an Indonesian island, as proof that isolated and unexpected human lineages were surviving in places nobody predicted, right around this same window of time. That single example shows how much of the human family tree during this period is still full of gaps, side branches, and populations we barely understand. Let that sink in for a moment. A member, or members of the human family, were apparently capable of reaching the far western edge of North America, more than 100,000 years before we thought any hominin had the ability, the boats, or the reason to get there. And we do not know their species. We do not know their route. We do not know if they came across a land bridge or worked their way down a coastline by water. There is actual evidence, completely separate from this site, that ancient humans elsewhere in the world were capable of crossing open water far earlier than expected. Stone hand axes have been found on the island of Crete, dated to at least 130,000 years old, on an island that has been surrounded by open sea for roughly 5 million years. Whoever made those axes had to get there somehow, and swimming was not an option. If early hominins had the capability to cross open water in the Mediterranean around the same time period, the idea of a coastal migration into North America 130,000 years ago suddenly does not sound quite as impossible. There is also an entire alternative theory about how people could have reached North America without ever using the famous inland land bridge at all. It is sometimes called the Kelp Highway theory, and it suggests that ancient coastal populations could have moved slowly down the Pacific coastline, island hopping and following the edge of the continent, living off the rich marine life found in kelp forest ecosystems the entire way. A route like that would not require crossing a frozen interior at all, and it would explain how someone could reach Southern California without leaving an obvious trail of evidence across the middle of the continent, since most of that ancient coastline is now underwater, submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. There is one more detail in this story that deserves its own spotlight, because it says something about how science actually works behind closed doors. After the initial discovery in 1992 and 1993, this find did not go public right away. It sat quietly inside the San Diego Natural History Museum's collection for more than a decade. Requests from outside researchers to examine the material were turned down. The implications of this discovery were so enormous and so likely to invite fierce criticism that going public without airtight evidence could have ended careers. It was not until the late 2000s, when archaeologists Stephen and Kathleen Holan took a fresh look at the bones and stones, that the case began to move forward again. All in, it took 22 years from the day Richard Cerutti spotted that first bone in the dirt to the day this discovery was finally published to the world in April of 2017. When the paper finally came out, the museum unveiled a permanent exhibit built around it, letting the public see the actual mastodon bones, the tusk, the molars, and the hammerstones displayed together for the first time, alongside detailed three-dimensional digital models created by researchers at the University of Michigan, so scientists anywhere in the world could examine the fracture patterns for themselves without ever touching the original bones. Now, no discovery this explosive gets a free pass, and it shouldn't. This is where we need to talk about the other side of the story, because real science is not about blind belief, it's about scrutiny. The backlash to this paper was immediate and fierce. One of the most repeated criticisms is the near-total absence of stone tools at the site. Archaeological sites, where ancient humans made or used tools, typically leave behind an abundance of evidence, not just a few hammerstones, but chips, flakes, and shattered debris from the tool-making process itself. At Cerutti, there were only 5 stones in total. Critics argue that real tool-making sites simply do not look like this. There is also the fact that no human bones, and no bones from any of the candidate species like Neanderthals, Denisovans, or Homo erectus, have ever been found anywhere near the site. The entire case rests on the condition of the mastodon bones and the wear patterns on a handful of rocks, not on a single physical trace of the beings who supposedly did this. Some critics have proposed a much simpler, much less dramatic explanation. A former land surveyor who worked for the highway department suggested that the damage seen on the bones and stones might have been caused not by ancient humans, but by the modern construction equipment itself. Remember, this entire site was first exposed by a massive excavator tearing through the ground. The theory goes that heavy machinery churning through the sediment could have created breaks and impact marks that only look intentional after the fact. Other respected archaeologists, including some who strongly support the idea that humans arrived in the Americas earlier than mainstream timelines suggest, still are not convinced by this specific case. One well-known researcher who helped establish a 14,500-year-old human site in Chile pointed out that the wear patterns on the Cerutti stones could simply be the result of natural processes, like the stones knocking against each other while being tumbled and moved by an ancient stream. Paleoanthropologists have also noted that ruling out every natural explanation for broken bone, including the slow, crushing pressure of sediment settling over more than 100,000 years, is an extremely difficult standard to meet with total certainty. The original research team has pushed back hard against this wave of criticism. One of the paper's own authors, paleontologist Dan Fisher, has argued that demanding one single piece of undeniable proof before accepting human involvement sets an unreasonable bar, one that most archaeological sites from this era would never be able to clear either. He has pointed out that when you look at the full combination of evidence together, the fracture patterns, the hammerstone wear, the placement of the bones, and the arrangement of the site itself, a human explanation becomes very hard to avoid. Thomas Desmarais has said publicly that the team fully expected this level of scrutiny. and has invited other scientists to examine the actual physical specimens directly, rather than simply critiquing photographs and data from a distance, arguing that a real resolution to this debate requires hands-on examination, not just outside speculation. So where does that leave us? The honest answer is unresolved, not disproven, not confirmed beyond doubt, sitting in that uncomfortable middle ground that makes actual scientists nervous and makes actual discoveries interesting. It is worth remembering that this would not be the first time an ancient discovery faced this exact kind of resistance before eventually being accepted. Fossilized human footprints found at White Sands National Park in New Mexico were initially dated to around 21 to 23,000 years old, and for years that date was treated with heavy skepticism because it clashed with the accepted timeline of human arrival in the Americas. Over time, independent studies using different dating methods kept confirming the same range, and eventually the scientific community came around. Today, those footprints are widely accepted as some of the oldest solid evidence of humans in the Americas. The Cerutti Site is not there yet. It may never get there, but it forces an uncomfortable question that a lot of mainstream archaeology would rather not sit with for too long. What if the story of who reached the Americas and when is nowhere near finished being written? What if 130,000 years ago, some early branch of the human family, whether Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo erectus, or something we do not even have a name for yet, made it all the way to the coast of what is now California, left behind a single scattered trace of their presence, and then vanished from the historical record completely, without descendants, without a name, and without a single bone of their own ever being found? Maybe they died out. Maybe it was a failed colonization, a small group that arrived, struggled, and disappeared without ever taking hold. Or maybe, somewhere out there, still buried under a highway, a hillside, or a housing development we have not built yet, there is more evidence waiting. Evidence that could finally answer who these people actually were. It is worth remembering that the Cerutti site itself was only found by accident, uncovered by a construction crew that had no idea what they were about to hit. Nobody went looking for a 130,000-year-old archaeological site under a California freeway. It found us, and that raises an unsettling possibility. How many other sites like this one are sitting under modern cities, modern highways, and modern housing developments right now, completely unknown, simply because nobody has cut into the right patch of ground yet? Every foundation poured, every road widened, and every drainage system dug is another chance for the ground to reveal something it has been hiding for over 100,000 years. The mastodon that died near San Diego 130,000 years ago could not have known that its bones would end up at the center of one of the most contentious debates in modern archaeology. A debate about how old the human story in the Americas really is, and about how much of that story is still missing. Somewhere between an accepted timeline that says 15,000 years and a controversial claim that says 130,000 years lies 100,000 years of human history that nobody has been able to prove, and nobody has been able to fully disprove either. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a discovery most people have never even heard of, subscribe for more, because history is full of moments like this one, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to ask the right question.